Case 1. Patrizia Reggiani. She once lived like royalty in Milan, dripping in diamonds, dressed in fur, and known by the Italian press as the Gucci wife. Patrizia Reggiani had married into one of the most iconic fashion dynasties in the world. Her husband, Maurizio Gucci, was the heir to the Gucci empire. Together they were fashion's power couple, frequent guests at elite galas, parties on Lake Como, and the talk of European high society. But after a bitter divorce and years of resentment, everything unraveled in a single calculated moment. Maurizio had left Patrizia for another woman, and the divorce settlement, though massive, wasn't enough to soothe the rage boiling beneath her glamorous surface. Patrizia had once said she'd rather weep in a Rolls-Royce than be happy on a bicycle. And when her luxurious life began slipping from her grasp, she began plotting a way to take it all back. On the morning of March 27, 1995, Maurizio Gucci was shot dead in the lobby of his Milan office. It was a clean hit. 3 bullets to the back, 1 to the head. At first, investigators were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate suspects. But behind the scenes, whispers pointed to Patrizia. The case cracked wide open 2 years later, when a tipster exposed the hitman-for-hire scheme. It turned out Patrizia had paid her psychic friend to help arrange the killing, along with a hired gun and getaway driver. The motive? A mix of jealousy, power, and money. Patrizia feared that Maurizio's new marriage would reduce her alimony, and she couldn't bear the idea of him moving on, especially with a younger woman. During the trial, the press had a field day. Patrizia showed up in designer clothes and dark sunglasses, earning the nickname Black Widow. Her arrogance stunned the courtroom. She claimed she wasn't mentally fit to stand trial. But her diary, found later, had entries celebrating Maurizio's death. One entry simply read, "Paradise." In 1998, Patrizia was convicted and sentenced to 29 years in prison. She served 18 before being released in 2016. Shockingly, even after her release, she never expressed remorse. When a journalist asked why she didn't kill Maurizio herself, she replied, "My eyesight is not so good. I didn't want to miss." Her story was later adapted into the Hollywood film House of Gucci, but no movie could fully capture the icy calculation behind the crime. Patrizia Reggiani wasn't just a glamorous woman who lost everything. She was a woman who believed she was entitled to everything, and proved that even the most dazzling diamonds can hide the darkest hearts. 2. Betty Broderick. At first glance, Betty Broderick was the embodiment of the American dream. A beautiful, well-dressed mother of 4, living in a San Diego mansion, married to a successful lawyer, and respected in high society circles. But beneath the manicured lawns and picture-perfect family portraits was a storm of betrayal, obsession, and emotional unraveling that would end in bloodshed. Betty had supported her husband, Dan Broderick, through medical school and then law school, sacrificing her own dreams to help build his career. Together, they rose to prominence. Dan became one of the most powerful medical malpractice attorneys in California, and Betty managed their home and children. But in the 1980s, the marriage began to crack. Dan hired a much younger legal assistant, Linda Colkenna. Soon, Betty suspected an affair. What followed was a brutal divorce that dragged on for years and left Betty feeling betrayed, discarded, and humiliated. Dan got the house, the money, and eventually, full custody of their children. Betty, once the polished socialite, was now voiceless and alone, spiraling emotionally as she left angry voicemails and even vandalized Dan's property in desperation. But on November 5, 1989, the pain exploded into violence. In the early hours of the morning, Betty took a revolver, used a key she had stolen from one of her children, and entered her ex-husband's home. Dan and Linda were asleep in bed. Betty shot them both, killing them instantly. She later claimed she didn't intend to kill, only to confront them. But the shots told another story. The courtroom saga that followed became one of the most watched trials of the early 90s. The media dubbed her the woman scorned. An opinion was split. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, others as a woman pushed past her breaking point. Betty Broderick was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life. She remains behind bars to this day, denied parole multiple times. Her story inspired books, documentaries, and even a dramatized series. But at its core, it remains a tragedy of ego, betrayal, and revenge. Here was a woman who once had everything: family, wealth, status, and lost it all in the name of justice, or perhaps vengeance. In the end, 2 lives were taken, 4 children were left orphaned, and a glamorous life was replaced by a prison cell. 3. Frances Schreuder. Frances Schreuder was born into privilege, a New York socialite, daughter of a wealthy investment banker, and raised in a world of art galleries, cocktail parties, and luxury penthouses. But beneath the pearls and polished smiles was a woman whose obsession with wealth, control, and social status knew no limits. Her ambition wasn't just to remain rich, it was to be worshipped. And she didn't care who had to die to get there. Frances had long manipulated her family for financial gain, constantly demanding money from her father, Franklin Bradshaw, a self-made millionaire from Utah who ran a thriving auto parts business. She wanted to maintain her glamorous Manhattan lifestyle, complete with designer clothes, ballet lessons for her children, and frequent shopping sprees. But when Franklin finally began pushing back and threatened to cut her off, Frances made a chilling decision. She didn't hire a hitman. She didn't pull the trigger herself. Instead, she coerced her own teenage son, Mark, into committing murder. Through years of psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, and twisted loyalty games, she planted the idea in his mind that his grandfather was the enemy, that he was hurting their family, and that removing him would make everything better. On July 23, 1978, 17-year-old Mark shot Franklin Bradshaw in the back of the head while he was working in his Salt Lake City garage. The crime stunned the community. A respected businessman murdered by his own grandson, with no immediate explanation. But as investigators followed the money trail and family dynamics, Frances' web of manipulation began to unravel. The trial captivated the nation. Frances was portrayed as a master manipulator, a narcissistic mother who treated her son as a pawn in a deadly game. The prosecution painted her as cold, calculating, and devoid of remorse. Her defense? That she was misunderstood, a struggling mother, not a monster. Ultimately, Frances was convicted of orchestrating the murder and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Her son, Mark, was tried as a juvenile and served a lighter sentence. Frances never fully admitted guilt, maintaining a facade of elegance even as she was led away in handcuffs. Her story became the subject of TV movies, books, and psychological analysis. Not because of gore or brutality, but because of how subtle, insidious, and emotionally chilling the crime was. A woman who lived in opera houses and marble foyers had turned her own son into a killer to protect her lifestyle. Frances Schreuder died in 2004, but the legacy of her manipulation still haunts the annals of true crime. She was the heiress who turned greed into a motive, motherhood into a weapon, and murder into a means of keeping up appearances. 4. Laurie Bembenek. She was beautiful, ambitious, and unforgettable. Laurie Bembenek, or as the tabloids dubbed her, Bambi, went from modeling for Playboy to becoming a Milwaukee police officer. She had the looks of a star, the drive of a climber, and the charm that made headlines. But her story would soon twist into one of the most controversial murder cases in American history, a case filled with sex, scandal, and a life sentence that shocked the nation. Laurie had a complicated relationship with authority. After being fired from the Milwaukee Police Department for filing a sexual discrimination complaint, she married a fellow officer, Fred Schultz. He had recently divorced his first wife, Christine, but Laurie stepped into that role without hesitation. Life should have been perfect, a fresh marriage, a future full of promise. But on May 28, 1981, Christine Schultz was found murdered in her home, shot in the back and bound with tape. Her 2 young sons were in the house at the time. The killer had broken in during the night, using a pair of Fred's off-duty handcuffs and one of his guns. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Laurie. Prosecutors claimed she saw Christine as a threat, a woman standing in the way of full control over her new husband's life, custody arrangements, and financial stability. The trial was sensational. Laurie's past as a Playboy model was splashed across front pages. The prosecution painted her as a jealous, vindictive woman who wanted her rival out of the picture. But Laurie insisted she was innocent, and that she was being framed by a corrupt police force looking to punish her for speaking out. Despite the drama, the jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison, A fall from glamour so stark, it became the subject of books, documentaries, and even a made-for-TV movie called Woman on the Run, the Laurie Bembenek story. But Laurie wasn't done. In 1990, she escaped from a Wisconsin prison and fled to Canada with the help of a romantic partner. For 3 months, she became a fugitive, a former cop and convicted murderer on the run. The media frenzy only intensified. When she was finally caught, her supporters began chanting a phrase that would define the case for years: "Run, Bambi, run." Eventually, her conviction was overturned due to procedural errors, and she accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, serving no additional time. Yet to this day, many still debate whether she was a killer or a woman crushed by a system that never gave her a chance. Laurie Bembenek died in 2010, but her story remains one of the most infamous and debated in true crime. A woman who had everything: beauty, media attention, and ambition, lost it all in a case where truth and spectacle were hopelessly tangled. Rose West. She appeared to be an ordinary British wife, quiet, private, a mother of 8. But what lay beneath the surface was a truth so disturbing, it shocked the entire nation. Rose West, alongside her husband Fred, was at the center of one of the most notorious criminal cases in UK history. A case that would forever change the way the public viewed domestic life behind closed doors. Born in 1953 in North Devon, Rose had a difficult upbringing that reportedly included instability and trauma. When she met Fred West in her teenage years, their relationship quickly turned intense. The two settled at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, where they built what seemed like a modest family home. But behind that front door, something far darker was unfolding. Over the years, numerous young women, some of them known to the couple, others vulnerable and alone, disappeared after coming into contact with the Wests. What began as rumors soon turned into a nationwide investigation. In 1994, police began excavating the property, uncovering buried remains that would reveal a long-hidden horror. Among the victims was Heather West, the couple's 16-year-old daughter, whose disappearance had always raised quiet suspicions. It wasn't until investigators acted on tips from within the family that the grim truth came to light. The garden, cellar, and surrounding areas of the property revealed the extent of the tragedy: lives lost and silenced, hidden in plain sight. Fred West died before his trial could begin. Rose West, however, faced justice. In 1995, she stood alone in court, charged with multiple counts of murder. After a lengthy trial and testimony from witnesses and surviving family members, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order, meaning she would never be released. Her case sent shockwaves across Britain, not just for the crimes themselves, but for the illusion she had maintained for so long. She was, to many who knew her casually, simply a mother and wife. But behind that image was a pattern of cruelty and manipulation that had gone unchecked for years. Today, Rose West remains one of the most infamous female prisoners in the UK. Her story is often referenced in discussions about coercive dynamics, manipulation, and the hidden nature of abuse. What happened at Cromwell Street has since been the subject of documentaries, books, and public debates. Not to sensationalize, but to understand how such events can occur undetected for so long. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most horrifying truths aren't found in distant places, but behind the doors of seemingly normal homes. And that justice, though delayed, can bring long overdue answers to those left behind. 6. Ruth Ellis. She was beautiful, elegant, and unforgettable. A nightclub hostess with platinum blonde hair and the kind of glamour that turned heads in 1950s London. But Ruth Ellis would become more than just a woman of allure. She would be remembered as the last woman to be executed in the United Kingdom, her name etched into history as both a tragic figure and a catalyst for legal reform. Born in 1926 in Wales, Ruth's early life was marked by hardship. She left school at 14, working various jobs to support her family. Eventually, she found herself in the nightlife scene, first as a model, then as a manager of a nightclub in London's West End. It was here she met David Blakely, a charming young man from a well-to-do background. Their relationship was passionate but volatile. Blakely, a racing driver, was known for drinking and infidelity. Ruth, in turn, was possessive and emotionally fragile. Theirs was a cycle of obsession, arguments, and reconciliation. A spiral that everyone around them saw, but no one could stop. On Easter Sunday 1955, everything changed. Outside the Magdala pub in Hampstead, Ruth waited. When David Blakely emerged, she pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and fired 5 times, striking him with 4 bullets. He died almost instantly. Ruth didn't flee. She was arrested on the spot, calmly telling officers, "It's obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him." That unambiguous statement would seal her fate. During her trial, Ruth showed little emotion. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a woman driven to desperation, emotionally abused, humiliated, and psychologically unraveling. But the law at the time made no allowances for this kind of emotional context. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The public reaction was immediate and polarizing. Thousands signed petitions pleading for clemency, arguing that Ruth had acted in a state of emotional torment, not with cold-blooded intent. But the Home Secretary refused to intervene. On July 13, 1955, Ruth Ellis was executed at Holloway Prison, just 28 years old. Her final words were heartbreakingly simple: "I'm sorry." The impact of her execution was profound. Debates raged across the UK, not only about the death penalty, but about how the justice system handled cases involving women, abuse, and mental health. In many ways, Ruth's case became a turning point in British legal history. Her death spurred a growing movement against capital punishment, contributing to its eventual abolition for murder in 1965. Today, Ruth Ellis remains a tragic icon, a woman whose life was defined by beauty, abuse, and a final act of irreversible violence. Her story forces us to ask difficult questions about justice, mercy, and the hidden pain that can exist behind a polished smile. 7. Rebecca Grossman.
And a judge has sentenced socialite Rebecca Grossman to 15 years to life.
She was a glamorous figure in Los Angeles high society, co-founder of a medical foundation, frequently seen at charity galas, and married to a prominent plastic surgeon. But in a matter of seconds, Rebecca Grossman went from philanthropist to convicted felon after a tragedy that shook one of California's most affluent suburbs to its core. On the evening of September 29, 2020, in the quiet community of Westlake Village, brothers Mark and Jacob Iskander, just 11 and 8 years old, were crossing the street with their parents. A crosswalk, a routine family walk. Until a white Mercedes SUV came barreling through at nearly 80 miles per hour, slamming into both boys and sending their bodies flying. Rebecca Grossman was behind the wheel. Witnesses and investigators would later reveal the full picture. She had been drinking earlier that day. She was allegedly racing with her boyfriend in a separate car. And despite striking the children, she didn't stop immediately, continuing for over a quarter mile before the vehicle finally came to a halt, with one of the boys' shoes lodged in the windshield. The community was horrified, the Iskander family devastated. 2 vibrant young lives were extinguished in an instant. And the woman responsible wasn't a hardened criminal, but a wealthy socialite with a spotless record, 2 children of her own, and a public image of compassion and care. During the trial, Grossman's defense insisted the crash was an accident. They blamed the other car, the lighting, even the children's movements. But prosecutors painted a different story, one of reckless entitlement, distraction, and absolute disregard for human life. Data pulled from her car showed she never once hit the brakes. In February 2024, Rebecca Grossman was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, gross vehicular manslaughter, and hit and run. In June, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The courtroom was packed as the Iskander parents gave their impact statements, tearful, powerful, and unforgettable. "You shattered our family," the boy's mother said. "You had everything, and you took everything from us." What made this case so shocking wasn't just the crime, it was the person behind it. Rebecca had the money, the status, the influence, but none of that mattered when the truth came out. The glittering image collapsed. The Mercedes, the parties, the designer clothes, all traded for a prison jumpsuit and a lifetime marked by grief. The Grossman case became a national headline not just because of its horror, but because it exposed the dangerous illusion that success equals responsibility. That privilege always protects. It doesn't. And for 2 innocent boys, it came at the ultimate cost. 8. Maria Popesco. In the elegant corridors of Swiss high society during the 1950s, Maria Popesco was seen as a rising star. Educated, graceful, and well-connected, she was the daughter of a Romanian diplomat and wife to a wealthy banker. But behind her cultivated charm lay a dark ambition that would destroy not only her future, but the life of someone close to her. In 1953, Geneva was rocked by the mysterious death of Maria's mother-in-law. The elderly woman had suddenly fallen ill, suffering from violent vomiting and seizures before dying shortly after. Initially, her death raised few suspicions, but when it was discovered she had ingested thallium, a highly toxic, nearly undetectable poison, investigators took a closer look. All signs began to point to Maria. The motive? Money. With the mother-in-law out of the way, Maria and her husband stood to inherit a significant fortune. But it wasn't just the inheritance that caught attention. It was Maria's behavior. Friends reported she seemed oddly calm, even relieved after the funeral. One even recalled her saying, "We can finally breathe now." Under questioning, Maria maintained her innocence. She claimed she had nothing to gain and that she loved her mother-in-law. But toxicology reports, conflicting witness accounts, and a suspicious bottle of medication found in her possession told another story. Prosecutors argued that Maria had poisoned the old woman gradually over several weeks, a cold, calculated murder disguised as an illness. In 1954, Maria Popesco was convicted of murder by poisoning and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through Europe, not just because of the crime, but because of who had committed it. A woman with status, a daughter of diplomacy, a socialite who once walked among the elite. But even after her conviction, the case didn't disappear quietly. Supporters of Maria, including prominent intellectuals and artists, insisted she had been framed. They argued the case was built on circumstantial evidence and bias against a glamorous foreign-born woman living in conservative Switzerland. Her case became a cause célèbre, a symbol of justice gone wrong or justice rightly served, depending on who you asked. Maria was released from prison after serving 12 years. She never confessed, never spoke of the case publicly again, and she lived the rest of her life in obscurity, far from the glittering life she once enjoyed. Today, the story of Maria Popesco remains one of the most haunting chapters in Swiss criminal history. A tale of beauty, wealth, and betrayal, where poison dripped behind porcelain smiles. It forces us to ask, how far would someone go to secure their fortune, and can the pursuit of luxury ever justify such cold-blooded acts? 9. Evelyn Dick. In post-war Canada, no name stirred more scandal or public obsession than Evelyn Dick. Her story had everything: beauty, mystery, sex, betrayal, and a headless torso found in a suitcase. What started as a grisly murder investigation quickly became one of the most sensational criminal trials in Canadian history, turning Evelyn into a dark icon of infamy. It was March 1946 when children playing on Hamilton Mountain stumbled upon a suitcase. Inside was the dismembered, headless torso of a man. That man was John Dick, Evelyn's estranged husband. And from the moment his body was identified, all eyes turned to the 25-year-old with the movie star looks and secrets to hide. Evelyn was no ordinary housewife. Known for her glamorous wardrobe, wild parties, and a revolving door of wealthy male companions, she lived a life of excess far beyond what her modest background should have allowed. She often boasted of powerful lovers and sugar daddies, some even rumored to be local politicians or mob-connected businessmen. When questioned about her husband's disappearance, Evelyn's story was filled with contradictions. At times tearful, other times eerily detached, she claimed not to know what had happened to John. But investigators soon discovered bloodstains in her car and a handsaw in her attic, stained with what appeared to be human tissue. Then came the twist that horrified the nation. During a deeper search of Evelyn's home, authorities found the mummified remains of a baby hidden in a cement-filled suitcase. That child was Evelyn's infant son, a second death that would add a macabre layer to an already shocking case. Charged with her husband's murder and later with infanticide, Evelyn pleaded not guilty. Her defense painted her as a victim, a woman manipulated by her father, her lovers, and a society that never gave her a chance. Her trial was a media circus. with headlines splashed across the country and crowds lining up outside the courthouse just to catch a glimpse of the woman dubbed Canada's Black Widow. In 1946, Evelyn was convicted of John Dick's murder and sentenced to hang. But a year later, her conviction was overturned on appeal due to lack of conclusive evidence. She was retried, this time for the death of her infant son, and sentenced to life in prison. She served just 11 years before being quietly released on parole in 1958 under a new identity. To this day, no one knows what happened to her after that. Her file was sealed, her name erased. But the legacy of Evelyn Dick lives on. In books, plays, and even folk songs that whisper the line, "Have you seen the hand of Evelyn Dick?" She was beautiful, she was deadly, and she vanished, just like the answers in her case. But one thing remains clear. Evelyn Dick is the original Canadian femme fatale, whose story continues to haunt the nation's criminal history. 10. Elivira Barny, London, 1932. The city's high society was buzzing with rumors, scandal, and the shocking arrest of one of their own, Elivira Barny, a glamorous socialite, actress, and daughter of a wealthy designer. Elivira moved in the most elite circles, dining with aristocrats, artists, and expats. But beneath the polished pearls and champagne toasts was a relationship spiraling toward ruin. One that would end in gunfire. On the night of May 30th, Elivira and her lover, Michael Scott Stephen, had returned to her Knightsbridge home after an evening of drinking and arguing. Just hours later, Michael lay dead, shot 5 times. Elivira, still in her evening gown, was arrested at the scene, allegedly telling police, "I did it, but I didn't mean to." It was a murder that stunned the press and captivated the public. How could a woman of such poise and privilege, who had once performed on West End stages and graced the most exclusive parties in London, become the center of a homicide investigation? At her trial, Elivira claimed the shooting was accidental, a chaotic moment during a drunken quarrel, possibly in self-defense. The prosecution painted her as emotionally unstable, volatile, and dangerously impulsive. But the jury saw something else. Perhaps a woman pushed to her limit by a toxic relationship in a world where appearances were everything. Despite the damning evidence and her own confusing statements, Elivira was acquitted of murder and manslaughter. The courtroom gasped. Some cheered. Others whispered of favoritism and the privilege of wealth. But her freedom came at a cost. The scandal followed her. Her family disowned her. She was shunned by the very circles that once celebrated her. Her name, once whispered in admiration, now echoed with disgrace. She moved to Paris, where she lived under a cloud of infamy, often drinking heavily and struggling with isolation. Just 4 years later, in 1936, Elivira Barny was found dead in a hotel room in France, reportedly from an overdose. She was only 30 years old. Though legally acquitted, Elivira never escaped the court of public opinion. Her story remains a haunting tale of glamour gone wrong, of a woman raised in luxury and privilege, adored for her beauty and charm, who ended up a tragic figure in one of Britain's most mysterious social scandals. Her case still divides opinion. Was she a killer shielded by class, a troubled woman pushed too far, or simply the product of a gilded world that offered her everything and took it all away? Glamour, wealth, beauty, influence. These women had it all. They wore designer gowns, mingled with the elite, and lived in homes most could only dream of. But somewhere along the line, the picture-perfect image shattered. Behind the diamonds and dinner parties was a darkness that no amount of luxury could hide. Patrizia Reggiani plotted the murder of her ex-husband in the shadows of the Gucci empire. Betty Broderick let rage drive her to destroy what remained of her family. Frances Schreuder used manipulation like a weapon, turning her own son into a killer. And Laurie Bembenek, once a police officer and a Playboy bunny, became the center of a media circus that blurred guilt and celebrity. Each case is different. Some were fueled by jealousy, others by greed. Some claim innocence to this day, others left behind legacies that changed the law itself. But the pattern is chilling. These were not women born into violence or raised on the streets. They were women society praised. Women who once stood on pedestals, now remembered through mugshots and murder trials. And maybe that's what disturbs us the most. How someone who seemingly has everything does, love, wealth, fame, lose it all for one irreversible act. Is it the pressure of a life built on appearances, the silent suffering beneath perfection, or the simple truth that darkness does not discriminate by income, gender, or social status? As we reflect on these stories, let's not forget the victims. The husbands, lovers, family members, and strangers who paid the ultimate price. Their lives were cut short, their stories often eclipsed by the spectacle surrounding their killers. But they mattered, and they must be remembered. And what about justice? Some of these women died in prison, others were released and disappeared into obscurity. One was acquitted, but never recovered her life. Was justice truly served in every case, or does power, even after a conviction, still cast a long shadow? Now it's your turn to speak. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Do you think justice was done, or do you believe some of these women were victims in their own way? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more real stories that peel back the polished surface and reveal the truth beneath, like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe for more cases that you won't believe, but can't ignore. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, behind every smile, behind every fortune, may lie a secret you were never meant to see.